Hey everyone, this is Jordon Lovell, and this is my presentation on counseling and Confucianism. I will be posting the handout that goes along with this, and it is incredibly long, and I'm sorry about that, but hopefully I organized it and put headings in places so that you can find information quickly if you were to ever need it, and I hope you will find it helpful. We won't be paying attention too much to the origins or the history of Confucianism, because I want to spend most of the time on what happens if somebody comes into our office and they state that they are an adherent to Confucianism. What do we do? So let's go ahead and jump right into it. I think this very first point is incredibly important because it has cross-cultural implications in general. And that is the idea of checking our assumptions about our client. So recognizing that if we have a client who states they're adhering to Confucianism, Confucianism itself is very Eastern in thought about everything. So recognizing that we in the Western world are probably not going to understand everything fully, but also recognizing that in our knowledge-saturated world, we probably have heard some things about Confucianism. Maybe we've only seen them on TV, or myself, I had very little engagement with Confucianism, other than, truthfully, fortune cookies, which is why I put a picture of a fortune cookie on there, because I think many of us in the Western world probably have very little impact or engagement with Confucianism, and get just little snippets of it here and there, and that develops really a picture that's incorrect. So being very careful about that, if you know a little, but also being very careful about it if you think you know a lot. It's important that we recognize that the client is the expert. Even if they come in and they seem very Western, and they decided to come to Confucianism later in life, so on and so forth, and we think that we probably know more than them, that's a really bad posture to have. It's really important to recognize that they're the expert in their beliefs, their value system, and we need to take a posture of learning and learn from them. And then secondly, Confucianism is very diverse, recognizing that there's regional differences depending on if they're from mainland China, Eastern Asia, Japan. All of those places have different ideas about what Confucianism is and how to practice it. And then also there's individual differences depending on who you have in your office. They may be completely devout to Confucianism and follow all of the aspects. Other people may be more nominal and kind of just have a cursory desire to follow the philosophy of Confucianism. It's very similar to Christianity. We experience that in the church today across the U.S. When we meet somebody in the grocery store who says they're a Christian, it doesn't really mean a whole lot because we don't know what vein of Christianity, what school of Christianity, so on and so forth. It's very similar with Confucianism, so it's important that we don't assume anything, that we allow our client to teach us. This next point I found really interesting because when I started my studies, obviously being in a world religion study, I thought that I was going to be studying a religion, but truthfully, Confucianism is not a religion. Confucius himself did not set out to create a religion, a philosophy, a theology of God or of the afterlife or anything like that. He was much more philosophical and humanistic. He recognized that people have these virtues within them, these potentials within them, that through self-discipline, through love, they can come out, and through those virtues expressing themselves into the world, we will have right behavior, we'll have good behavior. He really focused on the relationship between man and man versus man and God. He really wanted to look at how can we live in harmony with one another on this earth. And that was through right behavior, the development of virtue. And all of that was towards the aim of a very political goal of social order and harmony. Confucius looked at the individual and wanted the individual to live virtuously to the goal of this world that we live in, living in harmony and with death and evil and things like that, being pushed out essentially by the world as a whole, living in harmony, living in social order through virtuous, ethical living. So he wasn't trying to create a religion. he had very little to say on the topic of God or the afterlife. He didn't attempt to formulate a system of theology. All the different pieces of Confucianism that we see now, today in 2018, that have religious smells and tastes to them, came later, really through kind of a morphing of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, where Confucianism kind of adopted some of their metaphysics and some of their cosmology. But Confucius was not an agnostic or a skeptic. He was definitely influenced by the spiritual mindset of the day. However, he recognized that he wasn't an expert in religious topics or religious knowledge. That he took a very humble posture to that and didn't want to lead anyone astray. So he decided just really to discourage that conversation and focus mainly on the real practical, down-to-earth, so to speak, guidelines for righteous living. There's a quote down here at the bottom. In an era in which the main preoccupation of man was the struggle for very existence, Confucius, ever a humanist, set aside all metaphysical abstract speculation, not so much as unimportant, and that's important, but as comparatively irrelevant to a busy people faced with immediate problems. And he concentrated his attention upon providing an understandable and workable philosophy of life suited for all men. So again, he wasn't attempting to create a religion, he was attempting to create a system of ethics and virtues that would bring about peace and harmony on the world, basically. So what are those virtues, what are those ethics that he brought up? From his study of what are called the 6 classics of Chinese wisdom books, he came up with these, he really brought to life these old ideas and concepts and brought them into his day, and applied them to really the moral slackness and just the decay of society that he saw. So what are those? The first one, and really his main one, he called this the virtue of virtues, is called Zhen or Ren. And it really speaks of the relationship between people, between men, is the terms that he normally used. And the symbol itself is the symbol for man and the symbol for two, speaking of these two men being in relationship. And it spoke of a human-heartedness, recognizing that we're all human and that we're all connected to the degree that we're all on this world. And we need to love one another, show generosity, benevolence, empathy, unselfishness, self-sacrificing, and charity. That's really what this virtue is. It's all of those things. And it goes even deeper than that. Like I said, I don't think I'll be able to give you the full depth of meaning of these virtues. They're just so deep, and I humbly admit that I am not an expert by any means on Confucianism or the ideas and the concepts that he brought up. So definitely, again, taking that posture of learning when our clients come in, even after this slideshow, you won't be an expert, and I definitely am not an expert. So allowing the clients to teach us. But again, this virtue of Zhen, it's the denial of self and a response to what is right and proper. It's really extending yourself to another. The second important virtue is called Li, and this is really the idea of social etiquette, rituals, personal property, the concrete guide to human relationships. So again, all of this stuff came from these 6 classics. Confucius wrote very little, and what we do have now, his sayings and things like that, were written by his students and do come across as one-liners, like we read on like the tea bags and stuff like that. However, there's more depth to them when you read them in his writings. But again, all of that information that he got came from those 6 classics of Chinese wisdom books. And so from those, he translated the rituals and the rites that really had more to do with feudal lords into how to live in a harmonious society. So we need to recognize, this concept of Li recognizes that we affect each other, that every action affects someone else. Every word that we say, everything that we do affects those around us. And it's really, he saw that as really important. So not only were we supposed to love one another, but we're supposed to live in such a way that we recognize our behavior affects everyone. this limits the concept of individuality. He was not about self-actualization or individuation. He was about the self becoming virtuous so that the world around would be benefited. The last two that I want to talk about, just because they're so ingrained into Confucian thought as well as Chinese thought, is the concept of filial piety, which speaks of the family as the basic unit of society. The family was just so central. If the families are doing okay, then society will do okay. If the families are in harmony, society will be in harmony. This really spoke of the mutual love and respect between everybody in the family, but even more so, the love and respect that the youngers should show the elders. The kids should show the parents, so on and so forth. That was very, very important to Confucius himself and became very important to Chinese culture at large. The second one is rectification of names, which is an interesting concept that speaks of social status and role. Essentially, every person has a role, every person has a name in society, and it's important that they know what their duty is, know what their obligations and demands are, and that they follow through with those, because only by everybody following through on their role and then in their social position do we have social harmony. So very similar to the family, where you have family roles, it's important that they recognize their role in society and they live and are true to that name. So what do we do with that client who comes in? So now that we know, got some frame of reference for what they're going to be coming in their mindset, I came across several different articles that spoke of how to work with Confucius clients, and this is kind of that distilled down, and many of them said that brief, solution-focused, and goal-directed therapies are going to be most effective. And that's because, just as Confucius taught his students and his followers and disciples learn from him, they're going to come to you expecting you to be this person who can give them specific direction in life and show them how to be virtuous. So be aware of that. Be aware that they're coming in, seeing you as an authority figure, as a teacher, looking to learn. So you're going to have to deal with that in the therapy session. Another helpful theory of therapy is family systems. Obviously, going back to that concept of filial piety, with the families being so important, you may actually be dealing more with families than you are with individuals. And if you're dealing with an individual, that individual is going to be thinking about how his behavior is affecting his family. Humanistic therapies would also be helpful too, due to the fact that Confucius himself was humanistic, so his philosophy has a very humanistic vibe to it. And then mainly because we just studied this in psychotherapeutic systems, but I noticed that Adlerian's focus on social interests would also probably provide a good platform for talking to somebody in Confucianism, because it encourages people to engage in their society and to engage in healthy relationships. And then Adlerian's concept of family constellations too would also fit right in with that concept of filial piety. The interesting thing, what I loved about the articles that I found, is that they really did encourage you by saying that you don't need to go out and learn some new theory of therapy to be able to deal with and to be able to help Confucianist clients. The quote on the top: "One does not need to develop new therapeutic skills to work effectively with Chinese families. What is necessary is a sensitivity to the cultural context within which the problems exist, a flexibility in adjusting the standard therapeutic techniques and goals, and a willingness to acknowledge that one's definition of healthy psychological functioning may not be appropriate for clients with a different cultural background." That goes back to that very first slide, taking that posture, recognizing that we're not the experts, and that to some degree we need to follow our client's lead in what's going to be helpful. So really being in touch with our client, developing that therapeutic alliance. That second quote: "An important professional task is to learn how to relevantly select and use the concepts rooted in ancient Confucian teachings in order to conduct appropriate and effective therapy for contemporary Chinese." Again, we looked at just a couple of those virtues that Confucius taught, but those can easily be translated into particular interventions. They can be easily incorporated into a treatment plan because they have parallel concepts in many of the theories that we've been studying and will become practitioners of. Lastly, it's important to recognize that there's a lot of shame and stigma around the concept of counseling within Confucianism, and particularly because Confucianism and Chinese culture are so tied together, you almost can't separate them. When we're talking about this, we can almost just use the term Chinese as well. But what that says is that if somebody comes in who is Chinese or who states that they adhere to Confucianism, they've probably come to the end of their rope. They've probably reached a point where they have not been able to find help anywhere else. So recognize that they're probably going to be in a pretty tough place, but also recognize that it's going to be really difficult for them to open up. It's going to be difficult for them to really give 100% to the counseling sessions because of that shame and that stigma. So be ready for that as well, and to work with that in the sessions. It's also most likely that what they're coming in for is going to be interpersonal. Again, the relationship is so important in Confucius thought and in the Chinese culture that they're probably having issues in the family or in just getting along with other people in general. So that's really probably going to be the focus. It's not going to be so much of diving deep into past childhood experiences or anything that, but more focusing on relationships that aren't going well in the here and the now. It's also important, again, to recognize that for the client, while the self is important and they need to be disciplined in practicing virtue, all of that is towards the goal of bringing harmony to the family and bringing harmony to society. So recognize that clients will be looking for direction and help in doing that. So focusing on the self will be important, but they will probably push you to help them have better experience in their family and in society as a whole. And then lastly, all behavior within Confucius thought is judged by its impact on the group as a whole. So there's a very altruistic concept and conscientious concept, one in the positive, one in the negative, of do unto others as you would want them to do unto yourself, and don't do unto others what you wouldn't want them to do unto you. So again, their mindset's going to be very much how their behavior is affecting others, not so much how it's affecting them, which could be a hurdle and an obstacle in helping them deal with trauma or other things, because they're not going to really want to focus on themselves. They're going to want to focus on the others that they're hurting. They're not going to recognize how they're being hurt. So those are going to be some difficulties and some obstacles that you're going to have to face. And hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully you learned something that you didn't know before you started watching this. And hopefully you found it to some degree worth watching. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you in class. Thanks. Bye.